I'm Michael, events host here at RJ Julia. We're joined tonight by Sarah Parrish Morgan and Jaclyn Gilbert. Thanks everyone for coming. We're excited, and we're going to be discussing the new book Stroller. Well, some of the thoughts from Amanda and Jackie. We might have a little activity, it sounds like, a little bit later, which will be a lot of fun. After a brief intro, we'll turn the time over to our presenters. We'll have their discussion. We usually have some time for questions and that type of thing from the audience. And then after that, after the event, we'll move from our event space to our signing space over here. If you'd like to purchase a copy of the book, you can have it signed by Amanda.
Or by Jackie.
By Jackie also. I think it looked like you brought a couple of copies of your book also.
Yeah, I did just in case, but there's
Gotcha.
no worries with it.
Well, hopefully you'll tell us.
Okay.
Hopefully you'll tell us a little bit about your book also.
Okay.
So, yeah. So Sarah. Yes, that's right. Sorry. Amanda's author of Stroller, published in October 2022 by Bloomsbury. Her writing and essays have appeared in the 2021 Connecticut Literary Anthology, Guernica, The Rumpus, The Millions, Electric Literature, and several others. She lives in Connecticut and teaches at Fairfield University and the Westport Writers Workshop. Jackie received her MFA from Sarah Lawrence College and BA from Yale University. She's the recipient of a research fellowship from the New York Public Library, 2019 Artist in Residence at the Birdcliff Colony in Woodstock, contributed to Breadloaf, Tin House, Colgate Writers Conferences, and several other items worth mentioning, but for the sake of time. Also, yeah, we wanted to mention her novels called Late Air, which was released in 2018. For Stroller, among the many things expectant parents are told to buy, none is a more visible symbol of status and parenting philosophy than a stroller. Variety of attitudes and thoughts, seemingly about an object, are also revealing of how we believe parents and children ought to move through the world. Turn the time over to learn more about Stroller.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with some introductions. I'm excited to introduce Amanda. Amanda and I have been working together in different ways since my own novel came out in 2019. And not only as a writer was I drawn to her work in many published essays, and I was not only drawn to many of her published essays and articles, but I really wanted to see if I could work with her as a literary agent. So that time starting off my career in agenting, so we have a lot of different collaborative sides to our work. And Amanda's first book, Stroller, was published through Object Lessons, and it's an amazing series that looks at history, culture, and personal narrative through the lens of everyday objects. I know, like in Amanda's description, she's mentioned there's other objects that you can find that are really interesting, like doll, or even just like a object in nature that would allow you to explore these unexpected histories that are attached to the object. But in Stroller, Amanda does what Peter C. Baker at the New Yorker calls memoiristic cultural criticism. He goes on to point out the central strength of Stroller as not one simply rooted in its comprehensiveness as a guide, but for the singular ways in which Amanda critically investigates her own strollering years, making the stroller like an omnidirectional magnet, pulling disparate material into friendly proximity. Which is a really amazing review. We're extremely proud of it. And I couldn't agree more as an agent. But not only was Stroller also even more recently than that review listed among New Yorker's most anticipated books of 2022, which is really exciting. But it does something few books can, which is to give light to the everyday and often overlooked experience of taking care of ourselves and our children, all while trying to preserve some semblance of the creative life that existed before children or professional work, or both, became a center focus. One central question of this talk, and this is sort of like a segue, I guess, but one central question this talk is, what is your Pram in the hall? And Amanda will probably be better to explain what that is, but the pram in the hall is sort of what we think of as this metaphor of this object that could like a stroller that could exist in your house. That would be the reason why you can't do something that you might want to do. Whether it's, having time to write, read, knit, paint, build something in your house, do a fun project. Yeah, it's what's that thing that sort of gets in your way of going after that, maybe this other curiosity or passion that you have. And so that's kind of the main source of our discussion. We thought we'd both read a little bit from our own books to show, like, after we're done reading, we can talk about why maybe that particular section was a kind of pram in the hall for us, and then move into the other part of the discussion.
So I also wanted to, I think Jackie's gonna read first, or no, should I?
You should be
I
first,
read first. Okay, sorry. So I also want to talk about Jackie's book in a minute, but before I do that, I'm gonna read from Stroller. This pram in the hall thing came from, while I was doing research for the book, I had sort of gone down a rabbit hole of thinking about the difference in a pram and a stroller and other things that you could use to push kids around. And I came across this famous, but not then known to me, quote from this British literary critic, Cyril Connolly, who said, I paraphrasing, but something along the lines of, there's no greater enemy to art than the pram in the hall. And I just felt like, oh, who is this man? I do not like him. And the more I read about it, I realized that this line of his had actually kind of become an argument against which a lot of different authors and writers and playwrights responded, because he had this sort of very dismissive idea that if you have a child, then your artistic career is over. So while I was researching the book and came across his sort of famous one-liner, that led me to find all of these different essays that other writers and artists and playwrights had written in response to him. So I had the idea, like, what if all of these writers who found parenthood not to be an obstacle to creating art, but actually to be generative and creatively motivating or restorative, what if those people all had an opportunity to speak back to him, even though in real life he got to say that, and then keeping his famous literary critic self. So I wrote this kind of odd chapter in the book that I had so much fun writing, which is called The Pram in the Hall. And in that chapter, I took quotations from different essays that people had written in response to Cyril Connolly's comment and set it up as though it were a play. And then I decided to also just include myself in the play. So it's a little bit surreal. And this is one of the things I totally loved about writing this book, is that the editors of the Object Lesson series were so encouraging in terms of taking risks. And, I do a lot of freelance writing in terms of essays and articles, and often I'll hear, well, let's try to really rein it in and have it follow a very tight narrative arc, or really make sure it's really clear what the argument is. And when I was working on this book, so often I got feedback that was like, why don't you try something experimental or try something a little bit unusual? And this section is probably the weirdest section in the book, because it's, this imagined dialogue between people who in real life never actually got to speak with one another. But this is my imagining of what a chorus of parents, male and female, would have said back to Cyril Connolly about how parenthood had not been an obstacle to being artistic or pursuing a passion or an individual pursuit, but had actually been in some ways a boon to that endeavor. So as I read as now the second time I'm realizing my eyes are getting very bad, and I have to hold this one very close to my face. Okay, so the dialogue begins with Cyril Connolly. There is no more somber enemy of good art than the pram and hallway. Dane Jones. The pram in the hall was no somber enemy, rather, because I was baggy-eyed, vein-drenched in coffee, and blindly stepping into the new world of fatherhood, producing work had never felt more important to me. Stephen Wingate. So when I hear or see Cyril Connolly say that having kids is the enemy of good art, please pardon me for getting apoplectic. For me, not having kids turned out to be the enemy of good art. Becoming a father meant finally being forced by circumstance to claim a plot of metaphorical land where I had to dig out my own ditches, cut my own trees, and build my own literary house. No crowds or clicks could make a difference. There was nothing left but me and the words that poured out of my fingers. And oh yeah, the pram in the hallway that finally gave me my life meaning. beyond my own wants. Stephanie Merritt. Oh my God. I feel like I need to go see my house. It's like, it seems so dark in here. Okay. For the first decade or so of my son's life, I thought Cyril Connolly had it bang to write. This despite the fact that of the 8 books I've written, 7 were produced while trying to be a mother. I say trying because there is always this sense that you are scrambling to catch up, some feeling on top of things. Sorry. Really focusing.
Let's see if I can.
No, sorry, I think I should have just brought my glasses. That's my own fault. Thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, thanks. There's a feeling so common to most working mothers, I think, whatever the profession, but creative work makes particular demands that are in my experience, not easy to reconcile with parenthood. Most obviously, creating art demands the best of your energy and attention. So do children. People think that being a writer must be an ideal job to fit around raising a child because it's so flexible. But those people have usually not written novels. When you're immersed in creating an imaginary world, you have to live inside it. And that requires time and solitude, both of which are in short supply from others. It's true that being a parent opens up a range of emotional experience that can be invaluable for novelists, dramaturgs, or songwriters. But as with any demanding job, you can only really do it if you have someone on hand to do all the boring, routine, nuts and bolts parts of looking after the children. Jane Jones. I was creatively explosive, if a little loose and wild. I can't remember showering or looking in the mirror for weeks. Given the sudden constraints in my time, the pockets in which I could work were like mines, where I hacked away with a speed I've never experienced before. Discovering and publishing work, I do realize that I'm writing this from a place of privilege as a white educated male with a relaxed day job that allows me the brain space and ideas as this very piece. Trying to imagine myself as a full-time stay-at-home mother, trying to do work on a novel with an infant attached to my breast sends a chill through me. It would be much harder to get work done. My wife Melanie is our son's primary caregiver, a full-time student and works part-time as a massage therapist. Where I can come into the office and grab a cup of coffee, she has little to no time with her own thoughts. Stephanie Merritt. I certainly agree that the pressures to concentrate the mind. I am more driven and waste less time than I used to. I wrote my second novel while on maternity leave in a kind of frenzy at night in the gaps while my son slept, but I wouldn't recommend that way of working to anyone, even though there are famous examples of people who've made it work. If you're going to make good art, the creative process requires space to daydream, to immerse yourself in the project, and above all, to risk failure. Amanda. In some ways, though, I found that parenthood is conducive to a certain kind of immersion, at least in the sense of dreaming. As I walked through our neighborhood, I noticed things about the people, the houses, the landscapes that I never had before. On long car rides while the soundtrack of Frozen played, my mind wandered in a way that it doesn't when I'm listening to All Things Considered or an audiobook at 1.25 speed. Maybe in a way, that was subconsciously incorporated into the magic of children's stories and children's questions. Frank Kittrell voice. My children have been a crucial part of my work in ways I find hard to account for or anticipate. If I need to go on a research trip or for a book or a film, we'll usually go as a family. And I find that apart from the fact that it's useful to have an extra set of eyes and ears, people and places tend to open up to you more. Stephanie Merritt. Perhaps Connolly was touching on a larger point, namely that when you become a parent, your art is no longer the single biggest priority in your life to which you dedicate all of your time and energy. And that can feel like a compromise at first. Amanda. Pushing our stroller slowed me down in a way that let me see and think in ways I hadn't before. And then, at the end of these walks or runs with my children, I'll park the stroller into the grass or park it in the hall and take out my laptop and write as fast as I can, even if my idea wasn't perfect, while one of my children snored softly, napping and peaceful at my side. It was in this way that I could be the primary caregiver for our children and get time with my own thoughts. Sorry about my audio. It's terrible.
Sorry about the light.
No. I'm just going to read an introduction for Jackie, and then she's going to read part of her novel. So I got to know Jackie when I read an advanced copy of Late Air, Right away, I recognize an honest, complex depiction of the world of elite distance running, something that I've long thought might be impossible to render on the page, in the subtle, nuanced way that we forgive and move on from tragedy. Late Air has been praised by writers like Alexander T. and Melissa Tebos and lauded as being emotional but never melodramatic, and called a carefully plotted, cautiously hopeful novel about ties that outlast marriage. That is heart-wrenching character study of the aftermath of two life-altering events shows the different ways that adults cope with grief. In the years since, I've so appreciated Jackie's careful editorial eye, her attention to detail, and the way she pushes me to take artistic risks in pursuit of complicated ideas. I'm so grateful for our relationship and the way that we can talk candidly about the challenge of finding balance in the with life outside of writing. And it's great to be able to be talking in the same kindly, complicated way.
That's so awesome. Thank you. Yeah, it's been a little while, but I'm gonna read from Late Air. Kind of as Amanda described, it is about loss that divides two very different people in a marriage. The one person is this like very competitive distance coach who's never dealt with his grief, and his wife Nancy is more of an intellectual and an academic who sort of she had a very different way of dealing with it. And the structure of the novel is that the coach's story is set in the present, whereas Nancy, his wife, is set in the past, so it's kind of like catching up to his. And I'm going to read a little bit from a chapter was my most experimental chapter, where I sort of imagine what it would be like for Nancy to empathize, and what it would be like for her to empathize and understand with her husband's grief in the way that she couldn't when they first had this loss of a child, actually. Nancy began running in the mornings. She went at 6:30 a.m. for 2 loops around the bridle path in the park, where the ground was soft and smelled sweetly of manure, forcing owners to yank the leashes of their dogs harder, collars jangling in a mottled darkness. It was when they neared the reservoir or the slivers of path that offered a clear view of the water, when the sun began to rise 3 miles in, that Nancy could ease into a pace. It was here, even at the age of 49, that she was surprised she could focus on something else besides the stiffness in her muscles and joints, the endless cold in her lungs. She could focus on the morning light, how it flickered over the silver slant of high rises, casting their impressions, silent and still, over the water's glass, or the snow when it snowed like ribs along the path, or bare trees crisscrossed black like uneven spokes. In time, over the course of 7 months, she learned to abandon the pain of every step, to at least accept it as part of the process, of the discomfort that came and went. If she was patient, the pain always passed, and it was one of the few times in her life when there was no room for thought. The sensations of her body superseded it, and if focusing on those sensations was the only thing she could do, when she finished each run, her mind felt that much freer to think new thoughts, to feel hopeful, she supposed, about what the day might bring. She grew strong enough to hold a conversation with friends, grew open to talking across subjects that had not come easily before. Yes, there was always the weather and upcoming weekend plans, but there were also the movies she'd seen at the Angelica, the plays at Barrow Street Theater, the 2-hour lunch break she'd taken one Wednesday to try Korean barbecue with her coworkers, the Sunday evening she spent perusing contemporary books at the Strand. They could talk about running practice on Tuesday evenings at the East River track. Nancy didn't mind running in the slowest group, and she took frequent breaks between sets. And when it came time to race, she wore the singlet and shorts she got as a member. In these uniforms, she felt Murray's presence deeply, his sweat, the faded blue each item took on from repeated washing, and sometimes, no often really, she felt him adjusting her form. She knew from the diagrams he drew, her shoulders needed to be square, though they'd never be square, and her knees at 90 degrees, though her hip flexors were too tight to fulfill such a range. But she also felt him when she wanted to quit but didn't. When it was raining or snowing or below 10 degrees the following year, when she had to double up on spandex and gloves to get out the door, she felt him every time she braved uncertainty or forced order onto the disorder of a given day. And she was thankful for that, to picture him zipping up his coat and tying his shoes under the worst possible conditions. Nancy thought of him too as she began to discover new routes by running down the east side, past South Street Seaport to Battery Park. She ran through the gardens that hooked through the west side and continued down a path along the Hudson, scintillating in the sun, all the way up past Chelsea Piers and the Frying Pan, and the Sea, Air, and Space Museum, past the 59th Street Bridge, up Riverside Park and Washington Heights, once all the way to the cloisters in Fort Tryon Park, where her knees ached over cobblestones and the tamed grounds of its gardens, and she walked at magnificent halls, its chapels with illuminated manuscripts. Before her body chilled with sweat, she ventured to part of a great stone ledge and leaned over it, looking down at the water, this revised view of the small and distant river, still quiet and shimmering. And I'll just stop there.
When Jackie and I were talking about how we wanted to talk about this concept of the pram in the hall, one of the ideas that we kept coming back to was that it doesn't necessarily have to obviously literally be a pram in your hallway that feels like it's preventing you from writing, but that it also, we didn't want our discussion this evening to be limited to just talking about parenthood and creativity. So one of the things I wanted to ask Jackie about is, even though I know you wrote this novel before you were a parent yourself, but we talked a lot about how there are many prams in our halls and they can involve, you know, logistics or emotions or relationships or finances or intellectual curiosity, you know. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that section and why you wanted to read, like how that fits into this idea of it.
So I kind of, really, like, looking back, it's like really trippy to think about how I didn't have a child before I wrote this, and now I understand things that I thought before, but it's still radically different than what I feel about being a parent myself now. And I guess while like I didn't have, you know, the literal sort of constraint of really needing to be present and caring for my child, I did have a lot of other kinds of voices in my head that served as that pram in the hall. And I think one of the big ones was feeling like, in order to, and I still have this issue, but like in order to make time for my writing, I have to feel like it's not just for me, it's for something that other people would want to read and enjoy and would actually, you know, potentially make money. And I think that I don't really know exactly where this voice comes from. I think a lot of it might just be sort of no one maybe in my family ever like pursuing a creative path, or just feeling like my worth can sometimes like need a monetary like thing to substantiate it. So when I was writing this book, I kept thinking to myself, like, I really want to get an agent. Like, what if I fail, or I spent all this time on this thing, I never even like went anywhere. But I got to this point, you know, when I was like trying to finish it, and I knew it needed something, but I didn't know what. And I ended up actually, it's all kind of coming back to me, but I ended up booking an Airbnb in New Haven by myself, like a crazy person, and like walking around the Yale campus, like also like a crazy person, and just sort of like I spent these 2 days just kind of like writing by hand a chapter that I wouldn't typically write, and I focused more on the rhythm of the sentences and just sort of getting into a zone, and I reimagined a lot of the runs I did in the city, and I was like in my 20s, and it was really one of the most enjoyable things to write, and I thought, you know, I don't want to not put it in, but I kept thinking it didn't fit. And then I was really surprised when I put it in and I submitted it I guess submitted it. Yeah, I should know this as an agent. I queried it. I guess I'm now thinking what an agent does. Agent submits an author query. So I queried, you know, agents, and when the person who wanted to represent the book got back to me, she said, you know, this was the most cathartic chapter of the book, which I was glad, you know, to hear that, because there's a lot of loss in it. So in the story. So so I guess like my point is sort of like, although I had all these voices constantly telling me like, you know, make money or do something more commercial, I think I was glad that I still pushed through that and try this out. And now I feel like I'm still on a journey to like like I've had a lot of actually like kind of heartbreak around trying to publish a second book and it not feeling commercial enough. Because I tend to be a little bit more literary in my style, even though I want to tell an accessible story. And so I'm still battling that. Like, do I just go for the like really risky stuff, or do I try to make something like more publishable? And I'm kind of decided, like, if I have limited time, I'm just gonna do the risky stuff. And it's not that like it's just for me necessarily to read, but I kind of like the idea that just to make it is the thing. And no matter what happens, I can look back at that and be like, this is what I really enjoyed spending my time doing, because otherwise I definitely want to be with my son, you know, and like exploring with him. So yeah, so it's been like a real journey to figure out how to just kind of be with the process and not try to control it. Yeah, that was a really long answer, but yeah.
But I think that sort of gets back to what some of these people that I tried to bring their voices together are talking about, is this idea that when your time is limited, your focus becomes maybe a little bit more clear in terms of how you want to.
What your priorities are.
Yeah, exactly. And so whether that means you're focusing in terms of the type of writing you want to do, or I actually was thinking, so my youngest is in kindergarten this year. And so for the first time in a long time, I have almost a full work day of time to work. And I was like, wow, I'm really out of shape for the brutal like sprint of maximizing the hour and 47.5 minutes of nap time. You know, like I used to be such a pro at like, I'm gonna run on the treadmill while I'm reading a book that I'm gonna write a book review about. Like, I mean, it was a little bit pathological. Not, I mean, that's like a different event about
Yeah.
the quality of constantly doing things. But I was thinking, like, I'm not in that phase anymore, and I can like take a breath and slow down. But it's interesting to sort of notice that I don't know that I necessarily am creating anymore. Like, I'm definitely doing other things, you know, I'm grading my students' papers, or I'm planning a wonderful book event, or, you know, coming up with an idea for a future project. But in terms of like that raw, I have a limited amount of time that I can spend doing this thing I love, which for me is writing. And I'm just gonna pour as much as I possibly can into this limited window of time that I have. There is something that was so, you know, in the same way that, you know, if you only have 2 things on a menu to pick for dinner, it's easy to make your decision. It was sort of like, I only have 47 minutes to write, so I'm not going to sit around thinking about, is this going to be good enough, or is anybody going to publish it? Or even though, of course, those are things eventually that you have to consider. I felt like when I was at the height of limited time to work, that I know that I think in economics it's called the pre-restriction paradox. Someone told me that one time. And so even if it's not, I'm just going to call it that. The idea that having the vast amount of choices as a consumer, like when you go to an American supermarket and there are 100 different types of cereal, it can feel very overwhelming. And that it actually is freeing to have fewer choices. And I guess the thing that was so interesting to me about this Pram and the hall concept that you're talking about a little bit with taking stylistic risks and deciding how to spend your limited writing time, is that it doesn't always, whether the reason you have less time is because you're parenting or because you're working a full-time job that's demanding 99% of your work hours, that having less time doesn't always have to mean that you can't do something, can't pursue a creative outlet, even if it's not necessarily with professional goals. You know, like we were kind of have talked obviously together because of our agent writer relationship, but even just both as writers, we have maybe the professional angle that we're thinking about our writing time. But I kept thinking as I was writing this book about how it applies, I think, to any creative pursuit, even if it's not something that you're pursuing necessarily with professional goals.
Yeah, no, that's a really good way to think about. Like, I think this like really a major compression of time, and like the pressure we might feel to maximize this time. And you know, I think like one of the things I took away from Amanda's book is that like it can be a huge motivator to have that compression. You know, because it could really limit like if you have all these choices of what to do, you know, you're like, wait, no, I only, like, okay, these are the things I really want to do. What am I gonna do? But I think like another thing that, I think like I've been thinking a lot about lately is like, how do you even just create space just to like, sometimes you just like have to do nothing and just sit there and kind of open yourself up to what it is you are curious about, just even, to make space. Like I definitely had like a lot of hours when I was like trying, I wasn't able to breastfeed, so I like breast pumped a lot, but just like watching, a show and just sitting there. And I had it as a very like kind of a type A, like, someone who'd run in college, we always had to maximize our time. It was very new to me to just be like, I was watching the show, like, but then yeah, like I had gotten through all the like series, and my husband's like, are you okay? I'm like, Percy got the TV again. But anyway, I guess what I'm just saying is that like it's like, well, some of it's just like that clearing out that you have to do to figure it out is what is it you want to focus on, and that could be even if like you've got a really stressful job, like, and you don't have a lot of time, and so when you do have that time, like how are you going to think about what are those creative endeavors that that you have, and like I think it is okay to do nothing. I know we haven't really talked about that before, but I think we're both on that, like just thinking about that means to like prioritize just rest and clarity. So
yeah, I think that's such like a paradox of both of writing and of parenting, is that there's the importance of slowing down. And I tried to write a little bit about that in the section I read of literally strolling, pushing the stroller. And there's things you notice when you're at a walking pace that you would never notice running through a neighborhood, let alone driving or riding a bike. And the way you intimately get to know your surroundings, and maybe even you're narrating them to a baby and saying, oh, there's a bird, there's a excavator or whatever. And the way that can feel like such an intimate and beautiful way to get to know a physical space. And for me, I found that was the first time in a long time that I had slowed down, like I hadn't been in the habit of strolling in other times in my life until I had a baby that I wanted to help take a nap, or where I'm making my way at a preschooler's pace down the block and, stopping to look at the puddle or look at the.
And I think just imagining too through their eyes.
Exactly.
It's really cute. It's like, oh, like, it's like everything's sharp. Like when you like hear the birds, and I don't know, it's like, I actually, and I remember thinking like when Leland was born, I would go on this really long walk, and I was like, I have no idea like what I want to write about. And that was kind of a really new thing, because it felt like just like being such, felt like I was, such a different person with him around. So I sometimes would just literally like just talking to my phone, like if there was some moment I wanted to capture or whatever. And that kind of like, I realized looking back, it kind of was sharpening my observations in a different way, instead of it being about like this quantity of like production, like I got 5 pages done. So yeah, it also I think helps with your sort of like changes how you see, like you're just like seeing the world differently, how it's filtered through.
I was just thinking right now that I wonder if there's like for most writers or people who are doing any creative endeavor, a limited amount realistically of output that you can do in a day. And you can either admit that to yourself. I guess I should talk about myself. I could either admit that to myself and realize that I'm probably not, unless there's some, like I'm in college and I'm writing a final paper or something, going to write more than about 1,000 quality words on a good day,
That's good.
No, but I'm not on a good day, and you can either admit that to yourself, and sometimes that happens at rapid fire speed when the baby's taking a nap in the pram in the hall. But that I think it's like, I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a balance of contemplation and slowing down that has to happen to accompany productivity.
Right.
And
yes,
at different phases of my life, like right now, I don't have a baby anymore, and we don't even have a stroller anymore. So I'm not strolling right now. So, but I find that my mind is still like strolling in finding ways to wander away from those bursts of output. And now that I'm just realizing this as I'm saying it, it was a much more probably healthy and beautiful way to have strolling when I was literally outside with someone I love, showing beautiful things to a little child, than when I'm sitting on my computer refreshing Twitter or something, right? Like that there's only so much that most regular people can create at a time. And for me, parenthood was the first time that I kind of like was forced to admit that. And it was easier to admit because I could see that I wasn't weak and it was just that I had other obligations. And I think, if a lot of us are just very used to feeling like we have to account for every moment of our time and we have to always feel productive and that our days are measured in how much we do or how much we get done. And so sort of like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that balancing the paradox in if you have a brief window when you can write, finding a way to seize it as whether it's because you're a new parent or because you're working a demanding job or because your writing window is limited. But then at the same time, realizing that there's still immense value to those moments that are less obviously productive when you're strolling or narrating a voice to text on a walk or.
Yeah, you have to like, I guess it's a balance between being open to not seizing it for productivity versus like saying, okay, this actually like feels important to me. I'm gonna like do this.
Right.
And whatever that is. And that might not even be like writing it down. It could just be like capturing something that you want like in your life to like savor or I don't know. It's just that's like taking that step away to say, I wanna make time for something that no one's going to pay me for, might not even see, but I just feel like doing it right now. And so, and like, I think I think about this all the time because I think like with all the social media we have and all the different distractions, it can kind of feel impossible sometimes because like, and so I don't know, I mean, we can move into like the more like interactive side of it, but I was just thinking about how do you sort of have to trick yourself into giving yourself that time, even if it's 15 minutes just to sit there and like, or like, to have those moments you turn off your device or whatever, if that's something that you crave to try out. But yeah.
Yes, so I teach a class right now I live in Fairfield, and I teach a class through the Westport Writers Workshop that's on Zoom at 6 a.m. on Mondays. And today only Monday, it feels like it was a different universe that I taught this class. But every week at 6, it's just an hour long and everybody comes in their pajamas and drinks their coffee or tea and we turn our cameras on and I have a quick prompt, but the idea is that even if you get no other time to yourself that entire week, you've started off with this 1 hour that you can do some writing. And then it also builds, I think it's really important to feel like a sense of community and a sense of accountability. So, we see the same people week after week as a small group of writers. But through teaching this class, I've come to really love the idea of a prompt and just giving yourself a few minutes to try it out and say, okay, if after X number of minutes, this isn't giving me any ideas and I don't care about this and I'm feeling frustrated with it, I can abandon it. But I'm going to commit to, I have 5 minutes, even if I'm at the peak maximum busyness in my life, I have 5 minutes that I have set aside for myself. So sort of in that spirit, I had gathered some of the prompts that I sometimes use with my students. And I was just telling Jackie before I printed everything out. And then of course I left it in the printer tray. So I'm going to read it from my phone. I'm sorry to say, but I'm just going to read a few of the prompts. That's what the notebooks are for. I did put some pencils. If anyone doesn't have anything to write with, there's some pencils up there. Obviously, if you would rather write with something you brought, that's yes, Jeff.
So are you making this for people to choose from?
I was going to do one at a time.
Oh,
and just
okay.
do a few minutes.
Okay.
Each one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that
So it's like
okay?
a list. No, I was just
Yeah.
curious how it was gonna work because
Yeah, we're a little limited on time.
Okay, what time is it?
It's
Oh, I see. Oh my gosh. Okay.
is it really?
Oh, yes. Okay. So how about I just give you one prompt? And then we'll.
was it two? You got two? I would want more than one.
Okay.
Personally.
I'll do.
Would you
just
like
2
two?
minutes and I'll keep an eye on
So
it.
it's happened that like do you have time? Share.
I guess that's the balance. We usually try to end
Right.
to have
Okay.
more time for the signing, but
Okay.
we could either spend time on the prompt or with the questions,
Okay.
or sometimes we do the questions as we're going through the signing lines.
Okay.
And that could work too. Okay, so the first prompt that I wanted to offer was to think about an unlikable character. This my class and I did this morning, and this can work for fiction or nonfiction. And we're all used to hearing the idea that unlikable characters don't sell books or unlikable characters don't engage readers. But what if it's really more that characters who don't act, characters without agency, are what are not selling books or not enticing audiences? So I want you to think of an unlikable character, whether that's someone from your actual life, if you need to therapeutically write about an unlikable person that you actually know, That's how I think we came up with this prompt. I haven't dealt with an unlikable person. And then, you're gonna make that person take several actions very quickly. Or if it's a fictional character, you know, obviously if you don't fortunate enough to not have an unlikable person in your real life, you can make one up. But the idea is that, let's say you have an unlikable character who is sitting on a train riding from New Haven to Grand Central Station. So put your unlikable character on a train, but that character doesn't just get to sit there observing people in an unlikable way. That character has to do some things. So I'll just do a quick 90 seconds so we don't go too late with time. Write your unlikable character on a train for 90 seconds, doing some things, as many things as he or she can possibly do. Out of time on that one, you can ignore me and keep working on this one. Or the second option is to pick an object that you use every day. This really comes from the idea of the series. And just, this is not so much a written prompt as a brainstorming prompt. So write the word or phrase that it describes the object and circle it. And then you're just going to make almost like one of those elementary school style brainstorming webs where there are lines going outside of it. And you're writing every word that object connotes for you. So I went to my daughter's 3rd grade class and we talked about strollers, and I said, what do you think of when you hear about strollers? And they all said, they said like babies, pushing, falling over, like, everything from, and in a way they actually got it, like a lot of the really core ideas from the book. But you're going to pick an object that's important to you. It doesn't have to be one you've done any research about, but just an object that you use every day. And then just try to think, if you can, of at least 10 other words that come to mind when you think of that object. And those other words can be literal, like physical items that connect to it, or they can be more figurative descriptions. So let's do that. Try, if you can, to think of both negative and positive connotations that go with this object. Even if you love this object so much, think about the negative ways someone else might perceive it. Have your idea if you're in the middle of one. And then with this second activity, the idea is sort of like the next step would be either, if you're thinking of writing fiction or thinking about fiction, you can sort of think, what could this object reveal about character? If a character is using this object, how does that add a layer of our understanding to this character? Or if you're thinking in nonfiction, you could think about it a little bit more literally, like what are the cultural connotations of this object, and what is the history of it or the design of it reveal about our character? I know we're wrapping up on that, so I'll stop there.
I don't know what that. I'm sure we'll be okay.
So you want us to do that part?
I mean, this is what to do going forward, so we're
Okay.
basically out of time, but if you're
Okay.
thinking of using this as a start to a 10-minute writing burst or a bigger 5